Hello everyone and welcome to my video. Today we'll be looking at the top 5 builds that I had the most fun with in Elden Ring's new expansion. While these builds are certainly good and can most definitely carry you through the DLC, they are not the overall best in the game, as this ranking is based off of my own personal enjoyment of them. If you are someone who is looking for a fun build for their playthrough, or even New Game Plus, then I am positive that each one of these will be an enjoyable experience. Lastly, these builds are ranked in order from enjoyable to most enjoyable based off of my playthrough so far, and without further ado, let's get into it.
For the 5th spot in this list, I chose a build centered around the ancient Meteoric Ore Greatsword.
This build focuses around the new colossal sword found in the ruined forge of Starfall Past. It has the same moveset as other colossal swords except has a phenomenal Ash of War called White Light Charge. This signature skill causes the user to rush forward with a thrusting attack covering a large amount of distance and only costing 10 FP. Then, they may choose to thrust the sword again, causing a white lightning explosion for an additional 25 FP. I love this skill, and it takes away the one drawback that I have with colossal weapons, that being their antagonizing slow attack speed. This skill allows you to close so much distance so fast, and it is very helpful that you don't have to use the explosion if you don't want to, so that way you don't melt through your FP bar. To pair with this build, I chose to go with the Armor of Solitude set for two main reasons. First, it gives the player a lot more tankiness so they can play super aggressive with this skill, and two, it just looks really cool with the sword. For those of you who are wondering, you can get it by beating the Black Gal Knight that is at the Western Nameless Mausoleum, just northwest of the gravesite Plain Sight of Grace. Now, one small problem is that this armor is very heavy, and when paired with the weapon we are using, it is easy to get an unwanted heavy roll. That is why I have the gloves off, but you can always just wear different gloves or put more points into endurance.
Speaking of points, I have a level 180 build and have the main focus stats being Vigor, Endurance, Strength, and a little Arcane.
You can move these stats around as you see fit depending on your own playstyle, but I just found that this was what suited me best. Now, for the talismans, I used the Great Jar Arsenal in order to help with the heavy armor and weapon, the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman to add to our tankiness, the Shard of Alexander to add to the skill damage, and then the Two-Headed Turtle Talisman to help with stamina recovery. One suggestion I will make is consider switching out the Two-Headed Turtle Talisman for the Crimson Seed +1 variant, as this will allow you to get a lot more health back from your flasks. I tend to switch between these two a lot. Another talisman to keep your eye on is the Two-Handed Sword Talisman. This will buff the damage of all of your weapons attacks as long as you are two-handing it, except this does not include the Ash of War. I tend to use the Ash of War a lot, so I find that this talisman is not as useful as some of the others, but I feel like that I should mention it just in case. Now, for the final touches on this build, I would use the Opaline Hard tier and the Stone Barb Crack tier. This should help you with not only taking less damage, but breaking enemy stances, which you will find come very often as you are using a colossal weapon.
Coming in at the number 4 slot is a build centered around the new Starline Sword. This sword is a katana that you can obtain through killing demi-human Queen Mariga in the Cerulean Coast. It has a super appealing weapon skill called Onza's Line of Stars. This skill is split into 3 sections, which can all be inputted after each other to continue the combo chain further. The skill involves the player to lunge forward and do 2 slashes with an extended blade, followed up by an additional 2 if pressed again, and then lastly an overhead strike to finish it off. My favorite part of this skill has to be that you can end it almost whenever you want. Most of the bosses in this expansion give you very little time to strike them back, and being able to not commit to the whole string is a huge benefit. While still good against bosses, I would say that this skill's greatest strength is staggering smaller enemies. 99% of the time, if an enemy is not a boss, it will get locked into getting hit by all 6 hits of this combo, and that will most likely guarantee their death. To pair with this katana, I am using a couple melee support spells casted through the Carrion Regal Scepter. While options like Night Comet and Ronnie's Dark Moon can be super helpful, I found that the melee-focused build that this sword creates does best if you add support spells such as Glintblade Trio and Greatblade Phalanx. On top of that, this build does not run a lot of FP, so spells like Night Comet would eat through it way too fast. For the armor, I chose to go with the R'hllana set and the Navy Hood. There is no particular reason for this selection besides the obvious fashion it brings to the build. If you want a more practical option, I would recommend using the full R'hllana set, as with the helm, you reach the 51 poise benchmark. As far as stats go, I am running a level 180 build with the main priorities being Vigor, Dexterity, and Intelligence. Mind and Endurance are also important, but have a little more flexibility to them depending on what parts of the build you plan on using most. I personally found that 30 Mind was more than enough for me, so I would not recommend going over that. For the talismans, I chose an offensive and defensive mix consisting of the Magic Scorpion Charm, increasing our magic attack, the Dragon Crest Greatshield Talisman to help counteract the lower damage negation of the Magic Scorpion Charm, the Shard of Alexander to increase our weapon skill damage, and lastly the Crimson Seed Talisman to make our flasks more effective. Feel free to swap out any of these for other options based on your playstyle. I personally find defensive talismans such as the Crimson Seed and Dragon Crest Greatshield to be helpful, as the DLC, especially on New Game Plus runs, can hit really hard. Some other good options include the Two-Headed Turtle Talisman for stamina recovery, Radagon's Icon or the beloved Stardust for reduced casting speed, or the Graven Mass Talisman to increase the damage of your sorceries. As for the Wondrous Physic, I use the Magic Shroud and Crack tier paired with the Opaline Hard tier for more magic damage and less damage taken. This build allows the player many options as to how they approach fights and will destroy any non-boss enemy through staggers alone. When it comes to bosses, however, the skill will not stagger, so you have to get a little more creative. I found that setting up a Greatblade Phalanx and a Glintblade Trio before going in with the skill is a great way to get burst damage against bosses that normally will not let you get the full skill off. There's definitely a lot of ways this build can be played and customized due to the sorcery library available to you, and it certainly deserves a spot on this list. For the number 3 spot, I chose a Strength Faith build focused on the DeathKnight Long-halfted Axe, as well as utilizing incantations. This great axe is actually my favorite somber weapon to come out of this expansion. It has a skill very similar to the new Blink Bolt Ash of War. The difference is, if you follow it up with a heavy attack, then you will leap into the air and slam down with an additional lightning attack. This move is able to cover large gaps, has iframes while moving, and does a huge amount of regular and stance damage to enemies. You can find this weapon in the Scorpion River Catacombs after beating the Death Knight there. Besides the skill on this weapon, the normal light and heavy attacks on the Great Axe are also very solid, as they received multiple buffs when the DLC released. To fit the theme and to add a little range to this build, we will be making use of the new Knight's Lightning Spear incantation. It is by far one of the best spells in not only the DLC, but the whole game. Also, since we happen to spec into Faith, we might as well use Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength for extra damage. You will want to either use the Clawmark seal or the Erdtree seal depending on how much you spec into Faith. The Erdtree seal being better than the Clawmark at higher Faith levels. For the armor, I am using the DeathKnight set, as it not only looks great with this build, but also boosts Dragon Cult incantations and skills by 8% when the full set is on. That means that not only the skill of the axe is being boosted, but also the Knight's Lightning Spear incantation. You can find this armor set in the Dark Light Catacombs. For the build stats, we want to prioritize Vigor, Endurance, Strength, and Faith. I will say to not underestimate how much endurance you need, as the skill on this weapon uses a lot of stamina and can leave you completely out if you rush in too quickly. To help with this, I used the Two-Headed Turtle Talisman. For the other talismans, I used the usual Crimson Seed Talisman for health, and Shard of Alexander for more skill damage. The last slot is for the Lightning Scorpion Charm to boost the damage to the Knight's Lightning Spear and the Ash of War. As far as the Wondrous Physic goes, it is given to use the Lightning Shroud and Crack tier, but the other option can be a little looser. I recommend using either the Stone Barb Crack tier for stance breaking or the Opaline Hard tier for damage negation. This build is really good at doing many jobs well. You have quick and slow attacks when needed, a gap closer, and a range option that could carry you through the DLC by itself. If you do find yourself struggling, however, you can add almost any other incantations to your build to help out, as you do have a lot of points in faith. Lastly, I will say that it can be difficult to utilize the Ash of War to its fullest because its iframes on the dodge are a little tricky with the timing, but once you play with them for a little, they feel super good to pull off. I know I will definitely be coming back to this build in future playthroughs.
These final two can honestly be exchanged for each other, and I personally consider them equal and had amazing playthroughs with both. Though, even if it is by a slim margin, the number 2 spot goes to the Backhand Blades. This is a build I used on my first playthrough of the DLC, and I cannot express how much fun the Blind Spot Ash of War is. What it does is circle around the target and hit them while giving you iframes in order to dodge attacks. This means if you see an enemy do a final hit in a string, then you can just use this move instead of dodging. To be honest, it is just plain badass and very easy to use. The rest of the moveset also should not be ignored, as it has good strings of attacks and is able to proc the multi-hit talismans with ease. I am also very fond of the charged heavy attack, as it lunges forward quite far, and that makes it very easy to hit. I recommend going for the Keen affinity, as it gets an S scaling in dexterity, which is very nice. There are also many ways to add to the damage output, including Golden Vow, Flame Grant Me Strength, and most importantly, Electrify Armament. This will infuse the blades with lightning damage for the next 90 seconds, and the damage that it adds is dependent on only the faith scaling of your Sacred Seal. This means that the Erdtree seal is going to be the best for this build, so it is important to hit that 40 faith requirement. Now, if you thought that was it for the damage buffs, you would be wrong, as you can also add Millicent's Prosthesis, Rotten Wingsword Insignia, and Thorny Crack tier to rack up insane damage with successive hits. Additionally, using the Lightning Shrouded Crack tier and Shard of Alexander will further raise the potency of this build. As for other talismans to use, I, as you have probably caught on to by now, recommend the Two-Headed Turtle and Crimson Seed talismans, as they are almost a staple in any build that I use. I should also note that because you have 40 faith, you also have access to offensive spells like Knight's Lightning Spear, if you feel the need to have a ranged option. As for armor, I found myself using the Altered Raging Wolf set, as I think it looks really cool with these blades. Of course, feel free to put on more defensive and higher poise armor if you feel inclined. I found that this build really changed how I approached almost every encounter and made the fight seem like less of a your turn, my turn type of fight, and more like I control the pace of the duel. Definitely give it a try if you haven't, as it made my first run unforgettable. Now for the number 1 spot, the Milady Light Greatsword. If I'm being completely honest, I knew that this weapon would probably be my favorite as soon as I saw the DLC trailer showcasing it. It has long range, fast attacks, and the most enjoyable part of this weapon for me is the fact that you can combine different inputs of light and heavy attacks to make not only fluid but graceful combos that just feel so good to pull off. To top this all off, it has an exclusive Ash of War option called Wing Stance that gives the player the option to use 3 quick slashes or a lunging thrust that does very notable stance damage. For those of you who do not know, you can actually follow up the 3 slashes with the thrust if you use the light attack out of the stance followed by a heavy attack. Now, what if on top of all of that, I haven't even told you the best part of this build yet? What makes this build so fun is the addition of the Deflecting Hard tier. This is a new crystal tier added in the DLC that allows you to basically perfect deflect any attack and simultaneously boost your charge attack by 20% for each deflect you hit. This boost effect can stack, making your next guard counter hit for a max of 80% harder than it normally would. Additionally, hitting a perfect guard results in very little stamina being drained, so you can more effectively chain these deflects. You should also have no worry of this buff going away in any boss fight, as it lasts 5 minutes and that should give every player more than enough time. You can find this tier super early, as it drops from the first walking furnace that you see. Now, you might have noticed I didn't break down the stats of the previous build. This is because I used identical stats for both of these builds, so you can always just use both the Backhand Blades and the Milady if you want. This build focuses on Vigor, Endurance, Dexterity, and Faith. The Milady is also able to be buffed by the Electrify armament, so that's why we have a good amount of points allocated into Faith. Make sure to make the Milady Keen affinity, as our highest offensive stat is Dexterity. Because of the similarities between the top two builds, the talismans remain almost unchanged, besides the new addition of the two-handed sword talisman. This will be extremely useful, as I found myself almost exclusively two-handing this weapon. As previously mentioned, we will be using the Deflecting Hard tier, and also adding the Lightning Shroud and Crack tier for increased damage. When I said that the Blind Spot Ash of War changes how you play, this tier changes the entire game itself. Now, rolling can be a thing of the past, and I found myself using it as a secondary option, as parrying was much more rewarding. Bosses like Rolana become even more fun now, as it seems as though you're fighting on equal ground. It can also help that you get the Milady and the Wing Stance Ash of War as soon as you enter the DLC, as they're both located in Castle Incess. Speaking of the Ash of War, it is also extremely helpful, as it covers some of the weaknesses of the deflecting playstyle. An issue I sometimes had was that if the bosses hit you hard enough, while you can still deflect it, it would push you out of range of hitting a guard counter. The heavy attack option of the Wing Stance allows you to close that distance very easily, and also helps with breaking stances, as you will see a lot of those because of how many guard counters you're landing. If there is one idea you can take away from this video, it is to try this weapon with the Deflecting Hard tier, as it is genuinely a game changer. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go start my 6th playthrough with it. Hello again, and thank you for watching my video. This is the first video I have made, so I apologize if it was a little rough in some areas, but I'm a big Souls game enthusiast, so if you're interested in seeing any other videos relating to From Software titles, then consider subscribing and liking the video if you enjoyed it. If you have any requests for content or have cool build ideas, then let me know in the comments. With that, I hope you all have a good day, and see you next time.